Week 6 of the college football schedule features a Florida rivalry as the Florida State Seminoles host the Miami Hurricanes, one of the best teams in the country. We'll talk about the matchup. We'll talk about what you guys should be betting for this thing. We'll talk about Florida State's double OT loss last week. Good value on the Hurricanes in future markets as well. And of course, much, much more. Welcome to Oddshark Ninja here with Josie Costigan. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. If you are new, we are bringing you weekly college football preview videos, NFL preview videos, and much, much more. Josie, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. You had the under in Oregon Penn State last week. I believe it was 52.5. It was 3-3 at halftime. It was 10-3 after the third quarter. It finished at 54 points to go over that 52.5. How frustrating was that loss for you?
Yeah, pretty frustrating. That's kind of how I was expecting the game to go. I was expecting them to kind of struggle coming out the gate going, oh shit, maybe we haven't played decent teams. I was just hoping that when they did adjust, it wouldn't be such a massive offensive showdown. But all good things must come to an end. It was a fun little undefeated streak there.
It was a perfect run to start the season. You even had Drew Aller under passing yards in that one, which did hit. So that officially your first loss in the preview videos. But Josie, on to the matter at hand. Florida State comes in off their first loss of the season, the double OT loss at Virginia. How much shine did that loss take off this game?
Yeah, coming into last week, I feel like this had the potential to be a top 10 showdown. I actually featured that Virginia game in my upset of the week pick. I backed the Cavaliers to humble Florida State. My reasoning was pretty straightforward. I think the Seminoles' resume was built on some shaky ground. That week 1 upset over Bama was impressive on paper, but I feel like it kind of inflated expectations. Bama still threw for 250 yards, had 2 scores. And I think if Florida's run game didn't click, that outcome would have looked a little different. And then their next 2 wins, East Texas A&M and Kent State. I mean, basically the weakest opponents you could find statistically. Kent State came in with the worst run defense in the country. So Florida State racking up almost 500 rushing yards doesn't really tell us much. Virginia, on the other hand, I just thought they had the defensive and offensive tools to kind of slow them down and expose some of the flaws that I was kind of thinking that they had. So I think Florida State's loss gave us a clear picture of who this team really is. I think they're talented and explosive on the ground, no question. But if you can keep up with them, I think you make them look really ordinary.
I want to get back to that Florida State resume so far. But before I do, in your opinion, is Miami truly a top 3 football team in the country right now? Because as it stands in both polls going into week 6, Ohio State 1, Oregon 2, Miami 3. Do you agree with that right now?
Yeah, I think you can make the case that they are, but in my opinion, I just feel like there's not a lot of elite competition nationally to stand in their way this year. I think you have to keep an eye on Ohio State. That's the one team I think poses a legitimate threat. But beyond that, the rest of the AP poll kind of feels beatable, especially that back half. We've already seen a lot of top teams show cracks early in the season. I think Miami's been really consistent. They show that they can grind out, tough wins like week 1 against Notre Dame, and they can also dominate those lopsided matchup. I think the versatility makes them dangerous. But in a season where there aren't too many elite squads, that's probably exactly the profile of a program that you want and can rise to the top. But I think, who else is there really, show off?
No, I fully feel Miami is top 3, and I think we'll see them there at the end of the season as well. And on that note, let me ask you this. The Canes currently 11-1 to win the Natty. Isn't this, in your opinion, a great time to buy Miami futures, especially considering the remaining schedule? Like, bear with me here, because this might be the last time we see this kind of value, because they go, after this one, bye week, then it's versus Louisville, then Stanford, then away to SMU versus Syracuse versus NC State, at Virginia Tech, and at Pitt. That, to me, looks like a 12-0 schedule.
Yeah, I'd say yes and no. At 11-1, I think you're getting a number that still reflects some skepticism in the markets. And I think Miami's path does set them up really well. Again, like you just said, their toughest hurdle right now is this weekend versus Florida State. Syracuse maybe, but now Stephen Yelley's gone, so I feel like they're quieting down. So this and potentially an ACC title game. Again, for me though, the one true roadblocks is Ohio State. So beyond that, those power programs in the top 10 all look beatable. So that's where they have the advantage. So I think if you want to just roll the dice on Miami, this is the time you have to buy it. But if you're asking me, I'm not on them to win the title.
Let's look at that last week, the week 5 game then, the Florida State loss. The Seminoles didn't really get to Chandler Morris a whole lot with QB pressure, even though he did toss 3 picks in that game. But if Florida State's defense can apply pressure to a rejuvenated Carson Beck, could this get ugly real quick for Florida State?
Yeah, it absolutely could, and I think it's going to. I'm not here to disrespect Chandler Morris. In my opinion, I think he's actually the more versatile quarterback between him and Beck. He's thrown more yards. I think he's more dangerous on his legs, and he's shown that he can get it done when that protection kind of breaks down. That said, Carson Beck is a more seasoned vet. He's had a stint at Georgia, so I think he doesn't need to take unnecessary risks. He's not going to throw if he doesn't have to. He's not going to put himself in those vulnerable positions. And Miami doesn't really need him to be flashy. They rely on him to be efficient. You have Mark Fletcher on the ground, Malachi Tony averaging 12 yards a catch. So Beck doesn't need to be a hero. He just needs to take what the defense gives him. So if Florida State couldn't throw off Chandler Morris, I really don't see them rattling Carson Beck.
So you've already touched on it, but let's circle back to this point. Florida State, they're going to want to run the football. We know this. 4th in the country with 50 attempts per game. Great production from Sawchuk and Castellanos and a slew of others in that backfield. But Miami has an elite rushing defense, 5th in the country in terms of opponent rushing yards per game. Basically, this Canes team has stud players all over the field. So does the Florida State run game have what it takes to help them compete in this one? Because I feel like, and you've talked about it as well, maybe they've benefited from an incredibly soft schedule coming into this one.
Yeah, 1,000%. I think Seminoles rushing numbers look unreal on paper, but when you start to dig, it's just I don't know. Again, they racked up 500 yards against Kent State. That's the worst run defense in the nation. East Texas A&M, obviously, that's not much competition. Alabama in week 1, honestly, I think that was more catching the tide off guard and than proving Florida State's strengths. And let's just be honest, maybe Bama just isn't as tough as they used to be. That's why I picked Virginia to upset them. I just feel like the Seminoles rushing stats were, inflated by weak competition. And once they ran into a team with a real front seven, the Cavs were only giving up 114 yards per game, we saw the difference, okay? They still put up 250 yards on the ground, which is good, but they couldn't rely on it. And then they were kind of forced to step away from their bread and butter. So that's where you saw the 2 picks, the fumble. They only converted 6 of 15 third downs. So you can tell they're not comfortable when you push them further away from the ground attack. So to me, the formula to beat them is really straightforward. Limit the run, make them throw, and just push them outside their comfort zone.
And we'll get to your pick in a moment here, but for the folks at home, just a heads up. Miami, Florida State is featured in DraftKings Game of the Week promo this week. Once you opt in, you'll get a single-use profit boost token to be used on this game. It counts towards singles bets, parlays, same-game parlays. Profit boost expires at the end of the Game of the Week, so make sure you take advantage of that promo. And if you don't have an account at DraftKings, I will drop the link down below in the description. All right, Josie, you did have Drew Aller under passing yards last week, but dust yourself off a little bit from the bad beat in that total last week in Oregon, Penn State. What are you looking at for this one?
I'm really happy to grab Miami at -4.5 here. I think Miami's been the far more complete team through 4 games, scoring nearly 37 points per game while only giving up 11, which really just tells us they can control both sides of the ball. I think Florida State can be explosive offensively, but vulnerable defensively, and Virginia showed us that. Seminoles' entire identity here is built around their run game. Again, though, like we keep saying, I think that's a bit of stat padding against the weaker opponents. When they finally faced that competent defensive front Virginia, they couldn't dictate how the game was going to go. So now they run into a Miami defense that only allows 2.5 yards per carry. This is by far the best rush defense FSU has faced, easily. So if the Hurricanes take away that ground attack, Florida is going to be forced to rely on Castellanos' arm, and that's not a winning formula against the Canes here. So I like that. And then I've also got Malachi Tony, anytime touchdown score at +100. I like this kid. The last few games, we've seen Fletcher dictate the tempo and kind of establish a run game. He's been the centerpiece of this offense, and that's worked perfectly against these lopsided, weak opponents. But this week feels different. different for me. I just feel like Miami's going to flex its passing game a little bit more simply because FSU just like can't keep up in the air. So I think that's where Malachi Tony comes in, again, averaging 12 yards per reception. Clearly Carson Beck's go-to guy. It's interesting though. We keep talking about how he's like one of the best receivers in the country, but he only has one touchdown this season, and that came against Notre Dame, sadly. But that also happened to be the week that Fletcher had just like 65 yards on the ground. So Florida State just allowed 230 passing yards to Chandler Morris, who spread the ball without having, Miami's level of talent at wide receiver. So if they can't contain Virginia through the air, I don't see them keeping Malachi Tony bottled up this week.